There are a number of different things that the Torah says we may not mix together, but the parameters of those laws are different depending on what kind of a mixture it is that we're talking about. Let's start with the most well-known, shatnez. Gleich nach dem Tzivah of the Mr. Shatnez, immediately after the Torah tells us about the prohibition against shatnez, which is those silba shatnez semer fishim yachtov, that you may not wear clothing that is a mixture of wool and linen. Zogt on Torah, immediately after that the Torah says Gdilim taselu chalaba kanfis ksus chal gomer, that you have to make what is called tzitzis. In other words, from them was die zwei psukim stehen besmicha ze lo ze. The fact that these two psukim, these two verses, are juxtaposed side by side. Then up, we learn that you can make tzitzis even out of a mixture of kilayim of shatnez. As kilayim zayin mutter b'tzitzis. Okay, it's not the only place where it is permitted in the context of a mitzvah to wear a mixture of wool and linen. Same thing applies with the clothing that was the special uniform of the kohanim. Amongst the special clothes that the Kohanim would wear in the Beis Hamikdash while they were serving, is given the avneit. There was a belt, and a belt that the Kohanim wore was made out of a mixture of wool and linen. So there you see that even though typically you're not allowed to have a mixture of wool and linen in your clothing, for certain mitzvahs, tzitzis, and big tekuna, it is permitted. So therefore, Dafim Fashem, we have to understand. There are three kinds of forbidden mixtures that the Torah speaks about. Bekarka, in the ground, that you're not allowed to graft different types of plants. Bibehema, that you're not allowed to crossbreed animals. Ubivgadim, and clothing, which is shatnez. In fact, the Torah in our parasha puts them all in one continuum. Don't mix the seeds, the plants in your field. Don't plow with a donkey and an ox together. And do not wear shatnez. The same set of prohibitions is also in Parshas Kedoshim, and there too it says that you may not crossbreed animals, that you may not crossbreed plants, and you're not allowed to wear a mixture of wool and linen. So therefore, is my time, and the question is, what's the reason? How come the mixture of wool and linen the Torah permits in the context of certain mitzvahs, either the clothing of the kohanim or tzitzis? Whereas when it comes to mixtures of animals or of plants, then there's no scope for allowing those mixtures, either in a mitzvah or in the Beis Hamikdash. Why? What's the difference? What's the fundamental difference between the mixture of wool and linen versus other kinds of forbidden mixtures? Speaking of other kinds of forbidden mixtures, there's another one that's in a different category, but it has certain similarities. Besides the three forbidden mixtures, there's another prohibition in the Torah, which really seems to reflect the same kind of concept as the forbidden mixtures, and that is basa v'chalav, the fact that we may not mix either cooking or eating or benefiting from meat and milk. Obviously, it's mavur in Sfarim, as the time we use from basa v'chalav is kesoid hakilayim. Now, there are certain Kabbalistic books, like the Rekanti, who say that the fact that you may not mix meat and milk is similar in spiritual terms to the fact that you may not mix the other types of kilayim. Because it's a mixture of two separate types. Each one on its own is permitted. But when you mix them together, that's when they become forbidden. So the Mechilta says something really interesting. That there is a logical argument to say that when it comes to something which is associated with holiness, you should be permitted to have milk and meat mixed. Now, the only reason we don't do it is because the Torah says when it speaks about Reishis Bikurei at Moscha, that you're supposed to bring the first fruits to Hashem. Then it says straight after that that you may not cook meat and milk together. From that we learn, says the Mechilta, as in Beis Hashem Lekecha, from Basa B'chalav, that even in Hashem's home there is still the prohibition against the mixture of meat and milk. So you would have thought that you could mix them, but you can't. Which now shows us that when you're talking about forbidden mixtures, there are actually three categories. By kila begodim shatnez, if it's talking about a mixture of wool and linen clothing, hat the Torah matter gemacht kilaim by avodas hamikdash v'serim ze gehesen und by mitzvah tzitzis. We see that even though you're not allowed to have wool and linen together, in the Beis Hamikdash, not only is it permitted, it's instructed. That is what the uniform has to be. And in tzitzis, it's permitted. That's category 1. So it's normally forbidden, but in the context of certain mitzvahs, it's allowed. Second category is meat and milk, where there's a theory to suggest that maybe you should be allowed to mix milk and meat in a holy environment. But then you see that the Torah tells us, despite what we would have thought logically, we're actually not even allowed to mix meat and milk in the Beis Hamikdash. And then category 3, when it talks about crossbreeding either animals or the types of produce, is nobody even considers that there's ever a space, even in the holiest environment, where they may be mixed. You don't even have to derive from a pasuk that it's permitted. That it's forbidden. So we have to understand if all three of these prohibitions pretty much are the same concept, two things that in and of themselves are permitted, but when you mix them, that's the problem. The mixture of two things that are independently permitted. What is the reason that there be such different laws about how they are treated in a holy context? In order to get there, the first clue we'll get is from what the Ramban tells us about shatnez particularly. That it's specifically in the context of shatnez. That the Medrash tells us, that this is the exact mitzvah that the Yetzer Hara and the nations of the world will make fun of. But they don't make fun in the same way of our prohibition against crossbreeding, say, for example, animals. And as my voice, the Ramban explains why that is. The reason, when it comes to the mixture of wool and linen, is that the reason why we may not mix wool and linen is beyond the grasp of anybody. Nobody could appreciate what the reason is. What's the problem with this? Whereas the Ramban says you could give a logical explanation why it is that you should not be crossbreeding animals or mixing different types of produce. What's the reason? Because the way that the Eibusha created the world is that in plants and in animals, he gave them the capacity to reproduce in order that they should survive. And the Eibusha instructed them right at the beginning of creation that they are required to reproduce, and they have to reproduce the same species that they are. And therefore, if a person messes with that and mixes two kinds, as Markiv Shnei Behema, he crossbreeds two different species of animals, or he cross plants two different types of produce. The result is going to be a fruit or a piece of grain or an animal that doesn't look the same as the original that it came from, because it's got a mixture of the two different sources that were used in order to produce this creation. Every single piece, every single seed is a hybrid. It's a composite of two different things. That person is changing and actually contradicting and confusing the Eibishter's creation. So therefore, says the Ramban, it's logical that everybody can appreciate why we should not be crossbreeding animals or grafting plants. And then the fact that the Torah doesn't only prohibit us from actively crossbreeding different species of animals, but the Torah tells us you may not even plow with two different species of animals, an ox and a donkey, is because it's just normal that when a person is working with a certain group of animals in a particular role, he's going to keep them all in the same stables, and then it's very likely that they will end up being crossbred. So the whole reason not to work together is because you don't want to crossbreed them together, but the main issue is crossbreeding, which any thinking person can accept. Based on that information from the Ramban, we now appreciate that there's a fundamental difference between how the prohibition or how the concept of grafting works if it's animals or plants versus how the concept of shatnez works. When I take two animals and I crossbreed, when I take two plants and I graft them, not only am I putting two species next to each other, but I'm messing with their ability to reproduce. In other words, what I'm doing is I'm mixing them at a very core level of what they are. I'm changing the horse and the donkey into a mule. Over Mele is das Minige zu Sidney Meisebereshis as sollen seine Minehu Dafka. And that goes against the order of creation that Hashem made, which is that each species should remain in its species. And the same would apply to plants. Whereas with shatnez, a mixture of wool and linen, there's no mixing the core wool with the core linen in a way that they change. It's a pretty superficial mix. They're sitting together, they're woven into each other. Says no, all we're doing is we're sewing or weaving them together in the same place, which happens to be this particular garment. But after you've finished, this is wool, this is linen, and if I take the right kind of dye and I put it on, I'll be able to see that this changes color and this one doesn't. And then I can actually remove the offensive thread, and everything will be fine. Nobody's going to disappear. Nobody's going to lose their identity. So the Demis movement that then helps us to understand as the Geder HaTaruvus Ba'Basa B'Cholov is v'anoifen ha'mamutza tzvischen die zwei fane HaTaruvus Hanal. Then we understand we've got these two completely different kinds of mixtures. You've got mixtures which actually reformulate the DNA of the product, and you have mixtures which are simply the fact that you've attached two things to each other. In between the two of them is milk and meat. Why? Die Taruvus was B'Cholov is nicht azavik kila behema v'chulei was rührt on dem keach hatiloda. Obviously, if I mix meat and milk, I'm not changing the capacity to reproduce a new outcome that's going to be completely different. I'm not messing with the DNA of the meat and the milk. I'm not causing it to produce new beings that are going to be different for generations. All I'm doing is the physical meat is now mixed with the physical milk. And perhaps it's hot, and they all melt into each other. Now, nothing's going to change in the future. But on the other hand, meat and milk is definitely not the same as wool and linen. Because as we have identified, the wool remains wool, the linen remains linen. With the right technology, I can identify which is which, and I can separate them. Whereas as far as the Torah is concerned, the real problem with meat and milk begins when I cook them together. When I cook two things together, each now shares some of its flavor with the other and modifies the flavor of the other. So there is a change to each of the two items. Or not only that, even if you left meat lying in milk for 24 hours or more, then you fall into the category that anything which has the halachic status of pickling is the same as if it were cooked. In other words, the flavor will now be shared. No, dafka is the tokinis min Torah. Even though that's forbidden, it's not forbidden as far as the Torah is concerned. Even though it's kebishul, right? It's like it's cooked, but it's not the same as cooked. The only kind of mixture that the Torah forbids in the context of meat and milk is when they are cooked together, when there's a true transfer of flavor from one to the other. Meaning that when is the halakhic, the Torah's definition of the prohibition against meat and milk, when they become an entity, and it's a new entity. That's not like kilayim. It's not that shatnez. That is only achieved through cooking. By the way, that explains the opinion of Rabbi Levi in Gemara Chulin, where he says, as a shir kazayis v'nus b'cholov, we know that we're forbidden to eat a kazayis or more of a mixture of meat and milk. He says, is oich when sis do blois a chatzizayis basar v'chatzizayis cholov. Even if it's only half the kazayis is made up of meat and half the kazayis is made up of dairy, a kazayis and bein shneim, and only the mixture together produces a kazayis, that's still forbidden. You've still transgressed. Why? Because the prohibition over here does not apply to the meat or to the milk independently of each other. The whole prohibition only begins when they are mixed. Because at that point they become a new entity called meat and milk. So there's the three categories. Shatnez, there's zero mixture. If it's hybrids of animals or plants, there's absolute DNA restructuring that's going to affect the next creature that is produced from them. And basar b'chalav, there is a melding of the two into a new entity, but it's not going to have any effect on what they produce going further because they won't produce anything going further. Okay, so that helps us understand the three categories. Now we're going to plug that into a spiritual perspective, which in turn will help us understand why it is that there are different halachas about shatnez. That shatnez can be included in a mitzvah and is encouraged to be part and is required to be part of the big day kahuna, and the others not. So it's well known that Rabbi Bechaya explains that the prohibition against these forbidden mixtures is not an irba begashmi. It's not just because the physical mixture of these two types of products is problematic, but it implies that the minute we mix them in a physical sense, we're actually mixing inappropriately different spiritual energies. When you graft something together, you bring total opposites into play together where they should never meet, and we'll give an example in a moment. And therefore, that kind of bonding, that kind of fusing is never going to end well. Similarly, Rabbi Bechaya explains about the prohibition of meat and milk. He says, same kind of concept. Meat and milk each respectively represent different energies on high. Same concept. If I mix meat and milk here on earth, that creates a mixture in heaven of these two energies that should never mix. Now we know that it is explained in various places in Kabbalah and Chassidus, that wool and linen, which is similar to an ox and a donkey, or basar un chalav, meat and milk, they very often represent chesed and gvura. So linen is gvura, and wool is chesed, in the same way as the ox is gvura and the donkey is chesed. Meat is gvura, milk is chesed. These are attributes that are completely opposite to each other. And therefore, if you try and mix them together and house them in the same space, it doesn't work very well. It's like a tug of war pulling in two opposite directions. Now that we've started to identify the difference between mixtures that apply to animals and plants on the one hand, and mixtures that apply to clothing on the other, then you must say that this mixture of chesed and gvura, or whatever other spiritual forces that might be on high that don't go well together, there's obviously a very big difference between the nature of the spiritual energies represented by wool and linen versus the nature of the spiritual energies represented by hybrid animals or plants, and while we're about it, the spiritual energy represented by meat and milk. So in order to answer, to explain and understand and appreciate that difference, first we're going to raise a question, which is that there seems to be a question on what we explained earlier. That you're saying that there's a problem over here. You can't mix these two things together because they're different energies and they don't belong together. Hang on a second. Surely harmonizing difference is actually a positive thing. Isn't that what peace is? People who had a conflict and now you bring them together. Usually, bringing together opposites is considered a tremendous achievement. That is shalom. And the entire purpose of Torah is to create shalom in the world, including the shalom between this absolutely diverse reality of Eibishter and world, holiness and mundane. And one of the main areas that we have to work on within our own self-development is to bring our own attributes into harmony. That's one of the insights into the advice of Chazal, that a person should always be flexible like a reed and not strong and immobile like a cedar, as a man shot midas. That of course a person has to have their specific unique character traits, but they should be flexible, malleable. Was das meint, dass jede Midah geht zu der Midah Avchis, which means that every attribute within my system has to accommodate the possibility and the validity of a different midah. I can't only be a chesed personality. I can't only be a gvura personality. But as the Rambam clearly tells us that the ideal state of personal development is for a person to find the mean within every range of attributes. So usually, bringing opposites together is an ideal within Torah. Und da sagt man, as the Issa von Kelayim besteht in dem, was man ist me'arbe de midas von Chesed und Gevura. Here we're saying, no, you cannot mix the ox and the donkey because it's Chesed and Gevura. They should never go together. You cannot mix the Tzemer Upishtim because the wool and linen is Chesed and Gevura. They don't belong together. Meat and milk. Why? Why is it suddenly a problem? Steht auf dem de Biur, so the Tzemach Tzedek explains the explanation that the reason is as iskal osamidas in kedusha is aderech v'taruvas min b'minoi. When you're talking about holiness and you want to bring two different things in holiness together, you're mixing things that belong to the same world, they're the same spiritual species. Why is that? How is that? This is chesed, this is gvura, they're so different. Because the common denominator, in fact, the core reality of anything which is holy is it's all built on one fundamental principle, complete submission to Hashem. Und der Fall findet man, as in Avodas Hashem, können sein beide Midas Avchis de Chesed Gvura zusammen. That's what you find when a person is serving the Eibishter. It is quite possible, and it's actually ideal, that a person accommodates two very different opposite states. There steht in Sifri al Pasuk, "V'ahavtes Hashem lekecha," like the Sifri comments on the pasuk that says, "Lav Hashem your God." Ein lecha ava b'mkoim yira, v'yira b'mkoim ava. There is no place for love where you're supposed to experience awe, or awe where you're supposed to experience love, unless you're dealing with Eibishter's attributes. In a way. So what's the Tzemach Tzedek explaining? In Kedusha, everything is one concept: serve Eibishter. If it's chesed, if it's guru, if we have to work together, we'll work together. And but when you're dealing about mundane experiences, the whole reality of the mundane world is I exist, I know me, I feel my own reality. And I feel the reality of physical things to the extent that I could use them as a means to fulfill Hashem's mitzvahs, like tefillin. It's that sir von Yadamida mitatokef. So the design, the state of each one of the attributes is very powerful. And it's so strong, it's so identified, it's so defined that it doesn't allow the possibility of an alternative. Or befrat, Amida Hofkis, certainly not an opposing midah. That's the reality of our world. I am chesed, I cannot tolerate people who are not chesed people. Or vice versa. And therefore, in the world of love, there's no place for awe. In the world of awe, there's no place for love. Therefore, if I'm going to try now squeeze two opposite energies together in our world, I'm trying to put things that are two different species, two different worlds, two different realities together. It's not going to work. Whereas if I'm dealing in the world of holiness, where the entire thrust of the world of Kedusha, as the Alter Rebbe tells us in Tanya, is submission to Hashem. It's not about me. It's not about what I feel or what I think or how I perceive things or what my priorities are. It's about what the Eibishter wants. Then, seine Demidas Hofkius from Chesed und Gvura nicht bis nach das Ende zu der Zweite. Then Chesed and Gvura, even though by definition they are opposite, they don't clash. Neither of it to the contrary. They're actually one truth, one reality. What's the reality? Serve Hashem. The Teichen von beiden midas is eine und dasselbe Avodas Hashem. This is Chesed. What's the purpose of Chesed? To serve Hashem. This is Gvura. What's the purpose of Gvura? To serve Hashem. And a great illustration of that is the very famous Maimon Chazal about the pasuk that says that the Eibishter makes peace on high. Who's at war on high? That the Eibishter has to make peace. Say Chazal, Michol, Sar Shamayim, you have Michol, who is the angel of water. The Gabriel, Sar Shal Eish, Gabriel, the angel of fire. Vein Mechabin say they do not extinguish each other. Why not? Because seeing as they're in the Eibishter's presence, they are not conscious of their own identity and the strength of that identity and the needs of that identity. All they sense is we're here as the Eibishter's proxies, we're here as the Eibishter's representatives to do whatever it is that the Eibishter wants. There actually is no difference. We have different roles, but we're not different. You, Chesed, Michael, Sar Shamayim, you are the Eibishter's representative. You, Gavriel, Sar Shal Eish, Gevura, you're the Eibishter's representative. That's all that counts. The details of what you do, who you are, and your makeup, irrelevant. Like them, with that insight, we can understand the difference between the two groups of kilayim that we've explored. Kile behema v'karka, on the one hand, the hybrids of animals and plants, and kile begodim, on the other hand, the mixtures of wool and linen. Whenever you're trying to link together two things which are opposite, the two poles of the magnet, there are two possibilities of what's going to go wrong. So one thing that could happen is you completely obliterate their own sense of identity, and then you have shalom because we've overwhelmed them. Like when you're standing in the Eibishter's presence, you're not thinking about yourself. Or worse case scenario, we bring the two into the same arena and they are absolutely at war. That's going to cause division and conflict. And those are the two variations of how things that shouldn't be mixed land up being mixed. When people breed two different species of animals or graft two different species of plants, why are they doing it? Because their intention is, as Rabbi Bechaya says, that they want to produce a new creature, a different creature, a strange creature. So the goal is, let's create something different. Und ist der Chesson in dem Irrwurf darin, was durch dem werden seine Battle als zwei Personen in jeder Leute seine Tchunas chulei. So why is that offensive to the Torah? Because the Eibishter wanted a horse to be a horse and he wanted a donkey to be a donkey. And somebody is trying to create a mule. That's wrong. You're now canceling the world of donkeys. You're canceling the world of horses. This animal is going to be a different kind of animal. You're not permitted to do that. This person is going against what the Eibishter wants, because the Eibishter wanted these two species to be just that, two species. And the Eibishter wanted each of them to remain within their realm and with their purpose. And you're changing that. Like in the example of the two malachim on high. It's not the Pirish as durch bittul zu Melech HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When is battle die besondere Tafkidim from Michael Gavriel. We're not saying Chas v'Sholem. Now you have Gavriel who is fire and Michael who is water. That's it. Now standing in front of the Eibishter, we're going to cancel Gavriel's purpose of fire. We're going to cancel Michael. No, we're not saying that. Sar Shamayim is Sar Shadeish. That would be against what the Eibishter wants. The Eibishter created a Michael. He created a Gavriel. He wants them to be those things. Now, what happens is Michael remains the Sar Shal Mayim. Gavriel remains the Sar Shal Eish. Yet at the same time that they retain their identity and purpose in this context of doing what they wants, they don't cancel each other. So that's the representation. That's what's wrong with Kilei Behemoths and Kilei Zroim, that you're changing from what the Eibishter wanted. Because one of the possibilities is two things come together and they lose their identities. We don't want them to lose their identities. Whereas the mixture of wool and linen is the exact opposite issue. The wool will remain wool and the linen will remain linen. So they retain their identity, but their identity brings with it a spiritual energy of chesed or a spiritual energy of gvura, which are opposite, and now you're bringing them into the same space. And we're talking in what context? Wool and linen on earth, where there isn't that sense of bittul to Hashem. Therefore, the chesed is going to retain its identity and strength of chesed, and the gvura will of gvura. And so therefore what you're doing is you're mixing two things which are completely different species. That's only going to create conflict. The net result of that is going to be breakdown. It's going to be conflict. And we are not permitted to create conflict. With this information, we can now reassess why there are three categories of whether or not you could take a forbidden mixture and use it in a mitzvah context. Let's start with tzitzis, because that's what we said. You're allowed to have wool and linen together in tzitzis. And likewise, we said that you are supposed to specifically have the belt of the kohen made out of wool and linen. Remember, we said when you're in the Eibishter service and there is that sense of bittul, then when you bring two opposites together, it's a positive. It's not going to generate more conflict, which is the problem of wool and linen. You're bringing chesed as chesed and bringing gvura as gvura into the space, and therefore they're going to clash. Well, if they're in the Eibishter service, they're not going to clash. To the contrary, they're going to be in a sense of harmony because they're in the Eibishter service. So when I'm in mundane service, I can't put wool and linen together. In the Eibishter service, no problem. But when is that possible? But that's only an issue if the kind of mixture that would be produced is the kind of mixture that would generate ordinarily conflict. Well then, I'm in a realm of holiness, I don't have that conflict, I don't have that problem, there's no reason not to mix the two. Matzitzis can have wool and linen. But if the kind of mixture is not a problem of bringing two opposites into the same space, rather the issue is I'm going to cancel the separate energies as they were designed to be into one big melting pot, when I'm changing the Eibishter's design of creation, and it doesn't matter now if I'm talking about in a holy or mundane environment. Whatever the situation is, I am never authorized to change the parameters of Hashem's creation. Doesn't matter if it's in a holy context, I'm not allowed to do it. Und der Fall ist bei Kila Behema, bei Kila Karka, nicht talking, because Sakadaitach, Afil Asman Sols and Matter Zaim Mukdoshin. Therefore, there's absolutely no thought process. Nobody even imagines for a second you should ever be allowed to bring those two forces together, even in a holy environment, because it goes against what Hashem wants. Nobody has to prove from any psukim, because I know it's not on. Dafka by Bos Becholev. Whereas when it comes to meat and milk, where maybe it's more similar to wool and linen, because I'm not creating a core difference to the DNA of the product. Then I'll say, you know what? Maybe what I'm dealing with over here is a fear of bringing two different forces into the same space and they'll fight with each other. But if it's in the Eibishter space, it'll be okay. Maybe I'm allowed to have a mixture of meat and milk in the Eibishter's world. The maskana is therefore the Torah has to tell us as then in the Eibishter's house, even in the Eibishter's house, you're still not allowed to cook meat and milk together. Because the definition of something I may not do even in a holy environment is create a new reality that does not fit the parameters of Hashem's creation. It's when I put meat and milk together, it becomes a new entity called the forbidden mixture of meat and milk. That's much too close to grafting plants or crossbreeding animals. Which I'm never allowed to do, even in a holy environment. Now, Rabbi continues that when Mashiach comes, the prohibition against meat and milk will be cancelled. In fact, even earlier in history, we find that the Malachim who visited Avram Avinu were somehow able to eat the mixture of meat and milk. In context of what we've just learned, that actually makes a lot of sense. When you mix meat and milk together, we said what's changing over here is something physical is changing. The flavor is changing. The two items are now melted into each other. But we're not fundamentally changing the chesed that milk represents or the gvura that meat represents. Davon ist verstandig, als man die Kirche Israelionim was im Basar B'Chalav. So therefore, if I'm examining the higher spiritual energies embedded within meat and milk, which is the true sense of what meat and milk is all about, then in that regard, yes, the physical may have become a new entity, but chesed of the milk and gvura of the meat still remain, chesed and gvura. Much like the chesed of wool and the gvura of linen. And that's the big difference between the world in which we live and the world of Mashiach. We're living in a world where we can only experience and read the physical stuff. So if the physical stuff changes into a new entity, then there are laws of Torah which apply on physical earth for human beings living in bodies. What I'm seeing a result that looks the same as the result of grafting a plant or crossbreeding an animal. Something new is emerging. That's not allowed. Not only is it not allowed, it's not even allowed in the context of a mitzvah. Whereas when Mashiach comes, when Mashiach comes, the blinkers are off and we can now see with our own eyes that the Eibishter is real and the Eibishter is speaking, which means is needed sein Geshem v'chomer. No bitte bidvar havai durch welchen nasu pi Hashem diber. You know what we're going to see? We're not going to just see things as they appear, the physical, the material. We're going to see the divine energizer that makes them exist, which keeps every single thing alive. That's what we're going to see. In other words, we won't just see meat and milk, we'll see chesed and gvura. So when we look at the meat and the milk, we're going to see the truth of what milk is and the truth of what meat is. Then the Eibishter's energizing, creative word, and the higher energies that live within those things. And they're not going to lose those distinct, unique chesed gvura identities, even when the physical is mixed. And seeing as the entire world at that time will be like in the Beis Hamikdash, it will be in a state of holiness. In such a holy world, to the contrary, the Year from Basar B'Chalav Chesed Gvura and Kedusha is in Shon of Achdus. As we said, if you're in the world of holiness, then bringing opposites together is the greatest achievement. So in the world of Mashiach, where we're seeing the holiness rather than seeing the Gashmi, when we're seeing the experience of Hashem's creation, rather than just seeing the physical meat and milk, then we'll be able to accommodate and celebrate the greatness of bringing the two entities together. And Mitzvah Hashem, we should be zocher to experience that immediately.